Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center here at Michigan State University. And Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series. We're very happy today to have Dr. Selina Dessar as our guest speaker. And before I pass it over to her, a brief introduction. Dr. Selina Dessar is an assistant professor of anthropology and an affiliated faculty member in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department, the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, and the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of Texas at Houston. Her research focuses on performance and race linking West Africa and the African diaspora. She received her PhD with distinction at the University of Pennsylvania in joint program between African Studies and Anthropology. Dr. Dessar teaches courses on social difference, post-colonial urban life, popular culture, and migration. Her first book manuscript, Diaspora Without Displacement, The Coloniality and Promise of Capoeira in Senegal, is currently under contract with Duke University Press. She has also written think pieces for American ethnologists and cultural anthropology, and has an article forthcoming in Transforming Anthropology. Dr. Dessar is also a capoeirista who thinks and writes about the tension of being a Black anthropologist and co-conspirator in artistic community building. Thank you so much for being here. We're happy to have you. Now I pass it over to you, Dr. Dessar.
Thank you so much, Awa, and Andy for organizing. I'm really happy to be here today. So I'm going to be talking about a few different themes in my research. Mostly, I conducted ethnographic work on the first African-founded and African-led capoeira schools. And so we're going to talk about, the implications of that. But as Awa and I were just discussing before the talk, right, oftentimes we tend to try to box our work in terms of area studies focus, right? Is this a project about Brazil and the New World? Is this a project about West Africa? And I just wanted to frame my work and invite any students out there to sort of break out of those boxes, because there's certain kinds of work that requires a transnational focus and sort of a broader geographic thinking. So I did some ethnographic research in Senegal, but I also worked across the region in West Africa, and we're going to talk about why that is today. Okay. So the kind of through line of what I'll be dealing with, and we're going to go through a lot of different stories and themes today, but I just want us to kind of meditate on how post-colonial subjects, and particularly thinking about, global Black subjects, right? How do they make do and how do they thrive by creatively rethinking what is ordinary? And here, when I'm talking about the visual life and the material life, I'm also drawing on Ama Edo's work, who looks at Dutch wax print cloth and the kinds of implications of what we know as African cloth or African wax cloth, right? That is an object that is circulated and has, meaning attached to the African context, to the African continent, but is produced and has this sort of colonial legacy produced in the Netherlands, right? So how do we kind of connect design and production of objects, but also linking that imaginatively to place, circulation, their meaning, and even sort of unexpected routes that objects and visuals might take. So partly I'm also kind of going to be unpacking how we think about the quintessential, right? So oftentimes capoeira is referred to as a quintessential African or Black form. And so what does that mean to be looking for sort of a pristine model of something to sort of aspire to in that way? So for those of you, I always get different responses, and in a physical room, I would gauge who has heard of capoeira and who hasn't, and in what context. But capoeira is an interesting and kind of inherently unstable form of performance. It's oftentimes, referred to as a martial art. It can be seen as a sport. It can be seen as, a kind of having a dance aesthetic, right? And so part of what makes capoeira this difficult thing to pin down is that oftentimes we're trying to frame it through Western epistemologies of movement, of dance, of the divide between spectators and, practitioners, right? And so capoeira sort of breaks down a lot of these Western binaries of what we understand, dance or sport, et cetera, to be. So for our purposes, I think it's best to define it as a combat game. So in a sense, it is a collaborative, but also competitive activity that involves, a community of people. There's two folks often, centered in the middle of a roda or a circle. And capoeiristas, in the capoeira world, use the central metaphor of question and response, right? Or a kind of dialogue. So you're not necessarily trying to win or to sort of conquer the other person, but you are kind of gaining the upper hand through trickery, through even collaboration, right? Sometimes the goal is to trick the other person or to sweep them off their feet. And other times the goal is to have jogo bonito, right? A beautiful game. So you're working together to create a beautiful spectacle for the audience. But another one of the reasons why it's difficult to define capoeira as we know it today, now it's very commodified, it's very institutionalized. There are federations that are stemming from the Brazilian traditional schools. There's even been a push in recent years to have capoeira represented in the Olympics, for example. But originally, it emerged sometime in the late 18th, 19th century in Brazil. And it was an activity that occurred alongside other kinds of African and Afro-diasporic practices, such as candomblé and other spiritual traditions, or batuques, right, which were sort of drumming activities centered around drumming and those sort of ritual space that occurred in slave markets in Brazil. And all of the spectrum of things that I mentioned were on a scale of either being, frowned upon and denigrated by Portuguese colonial administrators and other European travelers, to a spectrum of actual legal prohibition. So in the late 19th century, capoeira was actually deemed illegal. And part of it was because it was also started to become not a criminal activity. In some ways it was violent, right? But actually a criminalized activity, right? So this is the sort of extension of how Black cultural forms were threatening in many ways to the Portuguese colonial state. And so here I put the term capoeiragem to refer to what was illegal at the time. It wasn't just the practice of capoeira, it was, the way that you were dressed, right? So here, for example, you see the yellow and the red of this man on the left. These all had to do with Bantu cosmologies stemming from the Kingdom of Congo in Angola, from which these practices were sort of foundational. And so it had to do with the way that men presented themselves, the way that they moved their bodies. There were even cases in which women were practicing early on. And so capoeiragem was this kind of loose, intentionally ambiguous way of criminalizing sort of Black bodies out of place, or Black bodies moving in ways that were threatening. So what happens to capoeira is it, like many other sort of African performance forms that come under duress, that are, reconstructions and reimaginations of traditions that came from the continent, is that then it gets sort of picked up and sanitized in a moment in which the settler colony needs to rebrand itself, right? So this happens in Brazil in the early 20th century, around 1930s, when Brazil, being the longest standing colony, being the last colonial space to abolish the slave trade in 1888, which was pretty late, suddenly, decades in, they have to rebrand themselves as liberal democracies, right? And part of the way of doing that is to single out isolate and sanitize certain cultural forms to demonstrate the kind of myth of, for Brazil, the myth of racial democracy, right? This idea that they have this undeniable blended racial heritage, but that it's a strength, it's an asset to the country. And it's also a legacy and a heritage that all Brazilians can claim in this particularly Brazilian ideology of how African, indigenous, and European influences come into the national sphere. But we see examples of this across Latin America. And so the first time that capoeira really starts to globalize when you see folks trying to escape the military dictatorship in the 70s and 80s. And so they're fleeing the country and using this kind of cultural knowledge to create a livelihood. Mostly they're migrating to Canada, to the United States, and to Europe, right? So the West. And capoeira was this vehicle for them to build their livelihood. So that happens in kind of a later moment, but the first time that capoeira as we know it today kind of returns, if you will, to the African continent or begins its route of leaving Brazil was actually in the World Festival of Negro Arts at the precipice of Senegal's, emerging and new sovereignty, right? So we have Senegal's first president, Léopold Sédar Senghor, who was one of the founders of the movement of negritude, right? Who called together artists from across the world to sort of represent Senegal, not just as an isolated nation, but as a Pan-African nation, right? And to position Senegal as one of the centers of Black modernism, right? So here you have a capoeira troupe and you also have a samba troupe that come from Brazil. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, that perform here. But Africans actually taking up the practice and taking ownership of it really doesn't come until the early 1990s with this film, Only the Strong. It's an incredibly cheesy and incredibly amazing TV film classic. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you check it out. There's also that classic film trope of the kind of ambiguous Latin. So you have a Spanish-speaking actor playing Brazilian characters, for example. But this film sort of single-handedly starts to dispense and disperse the idea of capoeira in a much larger scale than Brazilian migrants were able to in previous decades. So you hear stories of this across the African continent, but elsewhere in the world that, young people saw this movie on TV, took to the beach and started to train on their own. So this is part of how it starts to spread in West Africa. So the schools in West Africa that I look at are actually a pretty small and tight-knit social network. And so part of my research was moving through these kinds of social links and friendships that were built through this burgeoning capoeira movement in West Africa. I call it a network because they, will fund each other to show up at capoeira events. They'll support, the development of schools that are emerging in different places. And so for the most part, I'm looking at Africans who found their own capoeira schools, with the exception of this group here in Abidjan. That's actually Mestra Marcia, who's an Afro-Brazilian woman that married an Ivorian in Brazil, came to Abidjan and has a capoeira school called Olave there ever since. But for the most part, we see sort of, local leadership of capoeira schools. Here we have one of the newest groups, but one of the sort of fastest growing groups, the Capoeira Association of the Gambia, that has now proliferated other groups as well. Folks here also, because of the pandemic, are having now access to training with Brazilian capoeira mestres in the United States, in Europe. And so there's also this sort of virtual world of training and mentorship as well. But they're also strongly linked to the Senegalese group. Here we also have Nukunu Capoeira, which is a predominantly Ewe-led group, Nukunu meaning miracle. And, you know, I have an article coming out about this group in particular because they are exceptional in the way that they kind of conceptualize capoeira as coming from, right, partly foundationally from West Central Africa, but also being a blended form with West African, you know, predominantly Yoruba forms, as we see a lot of Yoruba forced migration to Brazil in the late 19th century. And so for them, because it's African in a sort of generalized way, that any Africans can claim not only the you know, sort of the right to practice or the right of sort of cultural or creative ownership over it, but that they also therefore have the right to innovate and move beyond African or Black movement traditions, right? So the group Nukunu also tends to mix Eastern martial arts movements. You'll see different kinds of ways of doing the Jenga, the sort of hand movement that are borrowed from Eastern martial arts. And they also have a really interesting use of kind of public education of dramatizing capoeira in theatrical performances to tell the stories of local African history that they feel is not being told and not being taught in the kind of colonial legacy of public education, right? So they're using capoeira dramatizations to tell stories, for example, of the early origin story of Ewe migration from the evil king Agokoli, for example. So they're an exceptional group, and they're also just amazing acrobats. They can like do backflips off of a palm tree. Yes, you got that right. You know, really incredible athletes here as well. And the final group I just want to mention is Ogunweru, which translates to My Heritage. This group is special, founded by Mestre Fasasi on the left, because this is actually the first African capoeirista to gain the status of mestre or master, right? So Brazilians have a sort of hold on the institutionalization of capoeira. In order to gain higher status, you have to be linked to other schools, right? And so he is also very strategic and diplomatic in approaching the Brazilian embassy, and was able to connect with a Brazilian capoeira mestre and sociologist who then also have worked with him for many years, and he gained the status of a capoeira mestre. So you're seeing the ways that Africa is sort of symbolically at the origins and at the heart of what capoeira is and how Brazilians brand it. But Africans themselves who are participating in the practice tend to be on the margins of global capoeira schools, right? So if we only have one African capoeira mestre, when we have, you know, countless numbers of Americans, we have, you know, basically capoeiras all over the world, and it's only sort of taking off the ground here. But the group that I worked most with and are, you know, my folks, my people, and my friends are Africa Capoeira, which is a pretty straightforward name, Ilha de Gore. So we see here also English and Portuguese in a Francophone context. And we're going to talk a little bit more about language in a second. But they're one of the most established schools in the region. They also provide a lot of support for other growing schools. They had, you know, in different moments, they've had strong representation of women, of young Senegalese, of working class Senegalese. But there was a moment in which Senegalese kind of made an exodus, and the group was sort of taken over more by other West and Central African educational migrants who had come to Dakar for a university, right, who are going to UCAD, who are looking for, you know, social ties, friendships, and leisure, and they started to kind of take over the group. And so one of the things I write about are not only the kinds of tensions between Brazilians and Europeans who have more sort of close access to the authenticity or the source of capoeira, but also the kinds of internal and regional frictions going on, sort of negotiating ownership over this form. So I'm going to be talking first a little bit about the visual life of capoeira in general, and then how that kind of impacts or breaks down when we get to the West African context. And then we'll move on to the material and go over some key objects to the construction of this new cultural world. So to go back to one of the classic images that we see, right, and this is of an early European traveler in colonial Brazil who painted these depictions. Capoeira was then sort of painted and continues to have this legacy of being seen as a quintessential form of Black resistance, right? So there are stories and evidence of capoeiristas, or capoeiras as they were known at the time, actually freeing themselves from enslavement through using, the use of their expertise, skills, and fighting form, their bodies essentially, rather than weapons or other forms of rebellion, right, to free themselves. There's also sort of a mythological connection to Quilombo dos Palmares, which is one of the largest and longest standing Maroon communities that Brazil had, that the Portuguese state was grappling with for a long time. And you'll hear the folklore of Zumbi and of the community of Palmares sung about in a lot of capoeira music, right? So while we don't have evidence of this 17th century community using capoeira as a way to defend themselves, there is this kind of imaginative tie that capoeira was the way that that community was established, right? But part of what I want to break down about the way that we think about it as this ultimate form of Black resistance to enslavement is not to say that that didn't occur, but that capoeira was a lot broader and also more, a contemporary word we would use today is inclusive, right, than we would commonly understand it to be. So while we do have, for example, the late 19th century, we see a police officer who was actually trained in capoeira in order to fight these, the development of these urbanized capoeira gangs called maltas that were in places like Rio de Janeiro. We also see the participation of not only West Central Africans, West Africans, but also free Black people and also white practitioners as well, right? And so this is something that we see with Afro-diasporic forms in general across Latin America. James Sweet writes about, African healing traditions, for example, and how white clients were also drawn to coming to be healed through traditional African medicines, right? So capoeira was no different in that way, right? But it was also a way of not just gaining freedom or resisting slavery, but it was a form of honor, right? It was a way of sort of establishing a masculine identity. Some folks reached the level of celebrity, for example, and were known in their neighborhood for, being the one to shake down everybody else, right? So we see this kind of diverse participation and these diverse uses of capoeira that start to break down this idea that it was only a form of resistance. And so I mentioned that early participation of diverse groups drawn to the practice in the 19th century to also foreground that moment that I talked about in 1966, where we have capoeira returning to Africa, if you will, in the Festival of World Arts, of Negro Arts in Dakar. So that event, that troupe was famously led by Mestre Pastinha. There are two key sort of grandfathers of capoeira that have branched into two genres of capoeira today, regional and capoeira Angola. And regional is linked to that moment that I mentioned of Brazil rebranding itself, of trying to be, leaning into modernism, but grappling with this dark history of slavery and now this Black population that they don't know what to do with and how to incorporate in the nation. Mestre Bimba tends to be, and I'd say unfairly, associated with the whitening or the sanitizing of capoeira in that moment. So he was responsible for implementing the uniform system, right? Sort of standardizing the movements, et cetera. Then about 10 years later, in the 1940s, we have a kind of reactionary movement led by Mestre Pastinha, pictured on the left here, to kind of re-Africanize capoeira. So we're already seeing these this back and forth, binary, as Ana Paula Hoffling mentions, was reflected in broader debates in Brazilian society at the time of what is African, what is modern, right? What is folklore and tradition and authenticity, and what is synthetic or constructed. So these two figures were pitted sort of against each other, and Pastinha to this day is still remembered as, the sort of re-Africanizing figure of capoeira by creating the genre of capoeira Angola. But you can see here, even in this key moment of diasporic return, of having the re-Africanization literally returning to Africa, you see that he had an interracial troupe there to perform with him as well. And these were, friends, students, colleagues, if you will, who were part of that sort of embodiment of diasporic return and representation in, again, this Pan-African festival celebration. But regardless of the, complex histories, right, we know that these forms tend to be overdetermined and oversimplified, but also get taken up within whatever political moment is important to folks at the time. So by the time capoeira returns, in a sense, to West Africans, that legacy of the quintessential Black form, the quintessential African form, is really strong and a compelling force for why West Africans are drawn to it. So here I have an example from a capoeirista in Lomé in Togo who defines it as, it's a Black culture. Capoeira is the time of our ancestors. It's the time of slavery. That, meaning slavery, can happen to us here. It happened to our ancestors, the slaves from Brazil, in the 19th century in Rio de Janeiro, right? So we see this kind of not only a sense of duty or legacy for Africans to carry out this tradition, but also this collapsing of time and space, right? That has to do with a global Black subject position of being a vulnerable subject, right? So slavery, it's the time of slavery. It happened to our ancestors, right? Either directly or imaginatively, thinking of their ancestors that were captive in Brazil, but then also saying it can happen to us here, right? So slavery is not just a historical event in their minds, it's also a potentiality for any global Black subject anywhere, right? And how do you combat slavery? With the quintessential form of combating slavery by training capoeira. So this is a motivation for some, right? And here we also have Pauline in Dakar who says, I really like the movements, it's pretty. And it also interested me that it's something that comes from Africa. So as an African, why do martial arts that come from Japan, right? And this, despite the national and continental scale, right? We see the ways that these symbols of nationalism, or these symbols of, claiming ownership of something that has worldwide recognition, like capoeira has for Brazil, is something that Africans are also understanding themselves to lay claim to, right? And it's also something that I think martial arts have a particular kind of appeal all over the world. We see Eastern martial arts as wildly popular in West Africa, but that kind of sense of heritage of it being a Black form often compels people to leave other martial arts or sports that they do and dedicate themselves. So you see that kind of personal connection. Not the same way that, for example, we would see lamb or like Senegalese traditional wrestling or traditional wrestling that we see across the region. It doesn't have that same kind of global appeal that capoeira does, or visibility, really. So I want to return a little bit to the kind of visual life and thinking about the intersections of race and also gender and how that affects the practice in West Africa. So the base step for capoeira is called ginga. And although there's little understanding of or evidence of its link to the Queen Jinga, there is obviously, at least in name, a link to the 17th century military strategist and political leader of Northern Angola, right? And so she was a very feared and revered figure. She was known for, resisting Portuguese encroachment and the encroachment of the slave trade in defense of her people. And partly, she was known for her military strategy because of the forms of combat and of martial arts that were prevalent in the region and that she herself was known to be an adept of, right? So whether or not the forms that she implemented were the base of what became capoeira later on, at least we have this imaginative link to a female figure, warrior, African leader, right? Who was not only known for her fighting, but the Portuguese seemed to be very obsessed with her gender expression and her sexuality, right? So you'll read in the archives all of these sort of outlandish claims that she was highly sexual, that she subordinated her husband to be the title of a queen, to elevate herself to a level of a king, that she was a pedophile, that she was a transsexual, right? You'll see all of these terms used to describe what was ultimately a threatening force in their eyes of a woman leader, right? So we have that kind of at the foundation of capoeira history, but the foundation of the literal movements themselves, right? So Jinga is also, as Christina Hauser writes about, was a threatening form of embodiment that the Portuguese colonial administrators in Brazil were very concerned with the way that Black men were moving their bodies and swinging their hips, right? And we now have this term in Brazil that's very celebrated called swingy, right? Which has to do with this kind of flow that you see as embedded in samba. We also see it as the foundation of why Brazilians are so good at soccer, right? But there's a way that that's very charged and racialized and connected to the kind of hypersexualization and the threatening embodiment that we see as linked to Africans, right? But even with these sort of genderqueer origins, if we want to think about them that way, of capoeira's history and symbolism, what happens in the 20th century and most recently is actually a very normative reinforcement of the way that we understand gender in capoeira's visual life and likely also in the actual world of capoeira. So we have Ashley Humphrey writes about this trope of capoeira girls that you'll see if you Google capoeira girls, women on Google. You'll tend to see thin, fit white women who are, either just wearing a sports bra, right? And she theorizes this not as girls or women doing capoeira, but the sexualization of women in a way that has to do with quintessential white femininity and using capoeira as a backdrop to sexualize women's bodies, right? And the sort of other side of this coin is the way that Black men or Afro-Brazilian men's bodies are a part of the commodification and the object of consumption for how capoeira becomes successful in Canada, the United States, pretty much across the world, right? So folks write about this as well, that there is a way that Afro-Brazilian men have to sort of lean into this the way that sort of capoeira is synonymous with the body of the teacher, and that there's an authenticity and an inherent kind of sexuality to the way that this form is taught and the appeal of consuming it for students around the world. So returning to West Africa, right? How does all of this kind of play out? Here I want to think with Ayokoli, who writes about the infamous Monument of African Renaissance that was built in Dakar, I think in 2009. When I was there in 2009, it was still being built. And there were rumors in Wakam, the neighboring neighborhood that the man had like laser eyes or something. It was a lot of hilarious jokes about what was essentially seen as not only a waste of money and resources from then President Abdoulaye Wade, but also a very inappropriate or sort of irrelevant depiction of Senegalese society at the time, right? That was really sort of facing outwards to the international community more so than it was for Senegalese themselves. So partly here, Coley writes about the trope of the African woman as not ever being a discourse about African women themselves, but always being a tool of dialogue between the post-colonial and colonial discourses. But I also wanted to point out here about the kind of the shirtless, this sort of like romanticized pre-colonial tropes of these sort of loincloths and also the shirtless man in a context that is predominantly Islamic, right? And we can debate what that means. There are also other spiritual practices that are very prevalent. But so we see also this context in which facing outwards, there are different kinds of depictions of masculinity than what are actually happening on the ground. And the same kind of thing happens in the capoeira world, where you have, shirtless guys posing on the beach for photos that they might post on Facebook, but never actually practicing shirtless in the training sessions or in other parts of the city, right? So the beach becomes this kind of, again, right, quintessential capoeira image, but it's not actually, their sort of lived reality of how they train capoeira in general. There's more of a respectability of covering yourself for men and for women. But I also wanted to point out that that kind of hypermasculinity that I mentioned that capoeira becomes associated with in Brazil and in the kind of capoeira diaspora is not the case in Senegal, right? And so here we have a phrase, fetu jigen, like a woman's dance, a womanly dance, that has been a sort of an insult leveled against West African men who train capoeira in Senegal, right? That they're sort of doing something that's not only inappropriate for a man in terms of being an unproductive activity, right? It's not making you money, it's not building your life, it's not sort of something an adult would do, it's not something a modern subject would do, but it's also about it being an inappropriate activity for a man. And this has to do with the ways that those kind of Western epistemologies of what is dance and what is, sport or, masculine athleticism gets part of the baggage that goes to Brazil and then returns to how capoeira is perceived in West Africa, right? So here we also have a teacher who's actually from the Congo that said, I've even been called a pédé, which is a slur to sort of attack his heterosexuality, right? If only they really knew what we could do, they would bite their tongue, right? So that visual life of the hypermasculine is in the minds and is actually part of the motivation oftentimes for why West African men are drawn to capoeira, but then it gets misread, right? And that kind of masculine performance tends to fail in these contexts. And so just to mention briefly what's going on with women, because I oftentimes also get this question of, I think there's a lot of assumptions that there's a sort of higher level of patriarchy that might go on in these martial arts schools here. And to be honest, you see the same kinds of dynamics here that you see in capoeira schools anywhere, right? Which is that these kinds of gendered ideologies about, women kind of censoring, but also the way that men interact with women, the assumption that, their bodies are slighter, that they have more difficulty with the athletic or acrobatic movements, right? That often can hinder women advancing in the martial art. But here I wanted to point to Elena, who's a good friend of mine, who's one of the highest ranking, she is the highest ranking woman in Africa Capoeira in Senegal. And for her, it wasn't just about the capoeira space, it also became a way that she was always interested in Black feminist politics in general, right? she's a medical doctor and became a dermatologist specialty. And part of that was because she was interested in these questions about natural hair and skin, and that she had, always been interested in these questions of how race sort of shows up on the body. So she started an organization using capoeira as a kind of symbolic motivation for doing feminist work in Senegal. So she's from Burkina Faso, but she came to Senegal to become a doctor. And again, we see this kind of symbolism of 17th century Congolese women that are now having this sort of revival right now of Kimpa Vita, which is the name of her organization, drawing on a Congolese spiritual prophet who, for her time understood that, saw Jesus as Congolese and as African, right? She was a kind of heretic in the Portuguese Catholic structure. And so she's sort of this rebellious inspiration, right? And so the idea of Kimpa Vita is to promote issues, environmental issues, zero waste, even promoting veganism, but also to support African women entrepreneurs. So what Elena and her co-organizer do is they put on events, they invite people to come, and there are booths of African women, business owners, where they can get that exposure to their business. And each of these events is also kind of a dance party, and it's themed with a different country from the African diaspora, Brazil being the inaugural country that they launched their organization with. But to her surprise, she found out that who she drew into the space tended to be white European expats, right? And so this was a struggle and continues to be a struggle for her of what kind of message she was trying to send out that was inspired by her trajectory in capoeira, but then having an overwhelmingly white presence into the space, right? And so for her, she's grappling the question, why are there no Africans at my event? Even less so Senegalese at my event, right? Part of it has to do with it being a sort of middle class, maybe prohibitively pricey event at like 10,000 CFA, about $20. But also we tend not to think about the way that a white presence is very ordinary in a space like Dakar, right? And part of that has to do with, Senegal being at this crossroads, as I mentioned, of being a vanguard of Pan-Africanism, but also being the site of the headquarters for all of the French colonial administration, right? So there's a long history and a long presence of whiteness there, and also Senegal having this sort of special status of having incorporating the 4 communes and having that slight edge of access to citizenship and to rights, even under colonial rule. Okay, so I'm going to move through some more positive examples in our last few minutes here and talk about what are the sort of material objects that are at the foundation of this group. So the central instrument in capoeira, for those of you who don't know, is the berimbau. It's made of a thin tree trunk that is strung kind of like a bow and arrow, and it has a gourd that, from which the sound emanates. You play it with a stick, a shaker, and a rock. And so part of the reverence that West African capoeiristas have is actually, they have a lot of respect for Brazil as the center of this practice, right? And especially so in the Senegalese group. However, right, being the sort of on the margins of the capoeira world, and also it being financially prohibitive, it's difficult to source the things that you need to create a kind of ordinary capoeira group where it's not the same kinds of issues of access in the United States or in Europe. So they are often required to see what kinds of resources they have locally in order to try to make up for the lack of having those as many imported objects as they need. And so we can think of this as a kind of resourcefulness, and I try to unpack or sort of decolonize the way that we often frame Africans as resourceful, as resilient, right? Rather than also as intentional and conscious, creative, cultural innovators, right? So partly the use of Kenkiliba trees, or maybe they're shrubs actually, is because this is a tree that is, is local. You can find it in different parts of the country, rather than the trees that you would source from Brazil. But it also has important symbolism that grounds capoeira, Senegalese capoeira, as coming from what is local and what is significant to Senegal. So Kenkiliba, for example, is used in local, for local medicinal purposes, right? It's the tea, which is very delicious, is known to sort of treat things like heart disease and, hypertension and things like that. And it also has, sort of more everyday symbolism connected to spirituality. So for example, we're in Ramadan, right? Oftentimes in certain households, Kenkiliba will be the tea used to break fast when you're having dates and sandwiches and things like that. So here is a sort of bundle or an order of Kenkiliba trees sourced from Tambacounda, the kind of interior region. And they're chopped down, smoked, and prepared, and then delivered to the capoeira school. And you see that the skin can kind of peel off and you have the instrument. But beyond the kind of practical and resourceful, we also see the creative and the aesthetic being developed in ways that are highly sort of localized in a way, right? So this was an event that drew capoeiristas from all over West Africa, and one capoeirista who leads the school in Guinea-Conakry came with his own highly decorated berimbau, and we see here the symbol of the Nimba mask that's prevalent all over Guinea. And we have cowrie shells, right, that were used as currency in the region, and that become sort of highly symbolic of Africanness or West Africanness in particular. So whereas what is African is highly visible with capoeira in Brazil and how it globalizes everywhere, here it becomes very localized, right? There you have sort of ethnic representations, you have national representations, and so folks are kind of making it their own. And here too, you see the colors that could be West African, Pan-African, even West Indian, right? The red, yellow, and green here. Okay. And so one of the things that is also very astounding is the ways that without that kind of link to the original instruments, the original objects, what happens is a kind of regionalism that gets revived almost by accident or almost sort of unintentionally, but in ways that sort of build regional ties that are unexpected even from the group. So here, as I mentioned before, capoeira uses a belt system, much like karate and other martial arts. But without that link to having a steady connection to Brazilian capoeira mestres, it's difficult to reconstruct the kinds of belts that are needed to keep that system in place. So sometimes you'll see, and it varies by the group, you'll see, just sort of like a regular braid, but it has to remain very tight. The belts last for, someone's entire lifetime. But there are other more intricate forms of braiding that have to do with, using a drill to twist them, which I've done. And it requires a certain kind of knowledge about how to build the belts, right? And so without, sometimes they source them from other places, but the group is an ever-changing kind of transient population. And so they have to kind of creatively come up with a way every year of how they're going to produce these belts. And so one of the things that I think about is Lusophone African capoeiristas who either they migrated or their parents migrated from, and by Lusophone, I mean Portuguese speaking, right? From Cape Verde, from Angola, from Guinea-Bissau, and they're now growing up in the Francophone and predominantly Wolof context of Senegal, right? And so a lot of times we see these Lusophone West Africans drawn to capoeira in order to reconnect with their heritage, right? And that heritage being Portuguese speaking and part of the Lusophone world. And so we have the example of Marianne, who is her folks come from a Manjak ethnic group from Guinea-Bissau, And she knew that there was an enclave in Dakar of Bissawan braiders, right, who were had this knowledge of how to braid in a particular way. And so she becomes an asset to the group to be able to put on their batizado, or their baptism ceremony of getting new belts, right? But I just wanted to point to not only the process here of the braiding, but also you see Christopher in the corner, who's from Central African Republic, filming on his phone, watching very carefully, asking questions, right? So he also migrated for school, and he's now, not only discovering how to braid belts in a particular way from these belt braiding experts, but he's also learning more about the geography of the city, right? He had never been to this neighborhood that had this Bissawan enclave here. And so sort of making those regional ties as well, and getting to know the city that he's lived in for over 10 years in a new way. And here you see on the left, he's modeling how these belts in a Guinea-Bissawan context, in a Manjak context, are used for funerary rituals, right? And are tied around the waist in that way. And so, yes, so I'll just mention briefly too, that when I'm thinking about this every day in this ordinary, I'm also thinking about the ways that what became ordinary in capoeira came from what was already sourced from West Africa, right? So things like gourds are very common. We have about, I think, 14 or so, correct me if I'm wrong, instruments in West Africa that are made from calabash, from gourds, that become part of what capoeira became in Brazil. But now it's something that they have ready access to, right? Unlike the berimbau trees, we have access to gourds to be able to, as I showed you before, create those beautiful painted cabasas for that part of the instrument. And so now this everyday object that you'd see, in a regular marketplace now becomes a diasporic object in this context. And here you see the belt ceremony carried out as well. And so the last kind of category of objects that I want to mention is not only the objects themselves, but how capoeira becomes a kind of everyday architecture built into the landscape of West Africa in these sites that are already layered with relics of the slave trade, right? So here we have Gore Island, where the group is closely linked. That's where they were founded. That's where they have regular trainings and workshops, and they often also perform or take tours in the House of Slaves there to keep that historical symbolism alive. But we also have new structures that are built, right? So this is the training grounds for the Capoeira Association of the Gambia that I mentioned, where they had this cement circle constructed. And not only does it, instantiate a local version of capoeira or a Gambian version of capoeira, but they're linking it symbolically to this kind of resolution of the trauma and the healing needed for the trauma of slavery, right? And saying that they understand that not only are Africans participating in something that's a hot global trend, but that in doing so, they are embodying a kind of healing and a kind of closing the gap. So here you have their training ground that they named as the door of return, right? To respond to the door of no return from a lot of these slave forts along the coast. And so I just wanted to end also with, the thinking about how capoeira becomes part of this everyday landscape, right? Here on the left, you have a guy who painted his door, spray painted his bedroom door with capoeira. And also these, very common objects in West Africa, the silver bracelets now being emblazoned with the symbolism of capoeira itself. And so we have this back and forth of what becomes ordinary and how the diasporic sort of returns, but also is resignified as new and now as normative at the same time. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dessar, for a very interesting presentation. But before we go to the questions, I just wanted to publicize for the folks who are here and in the Greater Lansing area. If you are interested in learning about capoeira, our colleagues in the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies are having a beginner capoeira lessons for free. Anybody can attend on April 10th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. in the International Center, room 303. So if you're interested, would like to learn some moves, experience what Dr. Dessar has been talking about, feel free to attend. It's a free event sponsored by the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at Michigan State University. So that was a word about that. But again, thank you so much. Very, very interesting. And if you have questions, you can type them or you can raise your hand and be allowed to ask your question. And as a comment, I am just fascinated by the regionalism, like how many West Africans, you talk not only in terms of linguistic, but the different region, Guinea-Bissau, Cote d'Ivoire, Cape Verde, they're all there, but now you have this form from Brazil that's uniting all these West Africans. It's just fascinating to me. And I'm wondering and we all know about how diverse the capitals of many cities, not only in Africa, are, but I was just curious, did you find any of these capoeira centers or in other parts of Senegal, for instance, or is it just in Dakar?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's a pretty urban phenomenon, and if you do find it elsewhere, it's rooted in those schools that are centered in the capital and that they're going out to teach. So part of the aspirations of a lot of these West African groups is to spread capoeira across their country. So you'll see them, creating workshops and having classes with other regions of the country in order to try to, as they think about it, like give capoeira back or gift capoeira to folks across the country, and particularly to young people. So you'll see tremendous efforts by folks who, it's not easy to live off of the arts of any kind, and especially not arts that are not well known, right? We can think about, hip hop or modern dance or other forms that have a longer history of institutionalization, of support, of, legibility, if you will, from sponsorship and funding and things like that. But capoeira is really, as of right now, a pretty grassroots and, individual-led and individually motivated practice. So you see folks, traveling up to Chess, traveling down to Mbur, trying to develop, little schools and to just spread the knowledge of capoeira. But I think that question of regionalism is so fascinating to me too, because I saw a talk in the Senegambian Studies group associated with ASA by Aliousi about the PAIGC liberation movement for Guinea-Bissau and for Cape Verde, and how women were organizing across these national lines, right? How folks like Chia Carmen were organizing, women in southern Senegal, in northern Senegal, and Guinea-Bissau. And I think we tend to be romanticized, or we're working so hard to try to understand, right? This is the legacy of African studies from the 60s, to understand like, what is the nation with regards to these new African nations, right? But we forget that the regional ties are a lot stronger and a lot older, and that they continue to exist, during colonial rule and after. But what's interesting to me is the fact that most capoeiristas were not really initially interested in making these regional connections, right? They wanted to have that legitimacy of being linked to Brazilian schools and at at second best, right, to European schools that had ties, right? Europeans that had the kind of resources to go to Brazil, to take Portuguese lessons, and so have that authenticity or expertise. And what happens is they're constantly opening themselves up to those relationships. You now see, pilgrimage trips of like a Brazilian teacher bringing European students to Senegal, to Benin, and having these collaborative, they call them like cultural exchange events, but African capoeiristas are getting completely sidelined, right? And so I saw this in the Gambia, where we all put on a performance for the International Day of Slavery, and it was predominantly European practitioners that were centered for the solos. Even in telling the history of Capoeira Angola, for example, that is the re-Africanized form, right? And once the stage was cleared and the performance was over, then we saw West Africans creating a roda on the stage after the performance and the audience had filmed out, had fled the space. And you see the Gambians wanting to learn from the Senegalese and saying, hey, we know you guys are older, school, can you teach us this and that? And starting to literally play capoeira with each other in a kind of mentorship because of the shared disappointment of how they were sidelined by the Brazilians and by the Europeans. And that created a long-term relationship now of Gambians going to Dakar to learn from their Senegalese, neighbors and coming back. So the regionalism, I call it kind of accidental. It comes out of this failure of that diasporic connection that they initially seek, right? So it's really interesting in that way. I can take Felicia's question here. Yeah, I appreciate this question, Felicia, if you also have any kinds of citations about how to think about the word jinga. Part of my theoretical intervention into this, and I didn't mention it, but there's a huge debate about the origins of capoeira, right? Is it Brazilian? Is it, West Central African? If it's West Central African, where can we locate it? Does it have to do with the Ngolu zebra dance? Does it have to do with, Northern Angola, Central Angola, right? Or whether it has more to do with West African and Yoruba traditions, right? And this debate is very important, but for me, my intervention is less about the actual material and empirical ways of proving, what a term means, what the symbol is linked to, and more about the kind of imaginative ways that West Africans are making the connection personal, right? So you hear, for example, the founder of the Gambian school says that capoeira comes from the Jola women's ceremony and dance spaces, right? That's the connection actually comes from Jola women. You also see folks in Gabon saying, oh, the berimbau comes from Gabon. I'm Fang, and we have a similar kind of instrument called the mvet there, right? We also have folks in Senegal who are thinking through, and I write about this as well, Ndep, which is a Lebu kind of ritual healing ceremony as a way of connecting with lost souls who were captive, and capoeira as being imaginatively linked to that. So while I think it's very important to try to trace the actual connections, what I'm more interested in studying right now is the way that people are imagining connections sort of symbolically rather than proving them, right? Because I think when we're dealing with Black history and with African history, there's a lot undocumented, there's a lot that's untrustworthy about what was documented in colonial archives, and there was a lot even that was actively destroyed and erased. So how are folks, imagining these connections as well?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. In terms of, yes, I totally understand. But I just wanted to, one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of discussions about capoeira that have been occurring, since the late 2000s, has been this positioning of Queen Nzinga as a reference. And as it might be, because there are young people looking at Queen Nzinga now in new sort of lenses, when it's always how it's discussed in capoeira, I do think is important, because it becomes part of of bringing it together with another sort of discourse that's about gender and identity. And if we as scholars keep lumping it together, putting it together without this reflection on what are the other possible sources of this word Zinga. Some of the Congo languages have this word interpreted with the idea of the motion of twisting or the spiral of time. And that word itself is very important to capoeira practice because it connects with the philosophical underbringing. So it's sort of, when I believe if we do not discuss the term, if we jump too quick and automatically say Jenga comes from this word in Zinga, we are now educating future capoeiristas that this is, we're setting the term, we're setting the definition ourselves as researchers. I think that this is just an important small point.
No, I don't think that's a small point at all. I think it's an amazing and important point, right? And I think that, you know, what I'm trying to talk about today is like, why wasn't Jenga linked to Jenga, right? Why do we think about that as connected today? Does it have to do with these kinds of colonial imaginaries, or what else is that erasing, right? I think that's a really important question. I even think about, for example, the Islamic roots of what might be at the heart of a lot of capoeira music, right? And so I write about that also in thinking about the way that Senegalese Muslim capoeiristas oftentimes have a resistance to the music, to the instruments, because they might see it as haram. But there were actually Senegambian Islamic scholars who were enslaved in Brazil. And we talk about the Malay revolt as this Islamic rebellion. And we also talk about these kinds of everyday forms of resistance in capoeira, but we never think about them together, right? But there's also a danger there in erasing, once again, which has already been erased many times, the way that Brazil tries to minimalize Bantu influence in a lot of its expressive forms, right? And that kind of jump to the Islamic can often erase what is Bantu, right? Or what is sort of might be emerging from that region. So I encourage that. And I think it's, I'm sort of calling more to wondering about what links are being made and what links are not being made and what's being erased. So I appreciate that. I can look to Emmanuel's question. Let's see, what are groups at any point? Welfare issues of its members. Yeah, so this is a great question because I focus on the motivations of African founders of capoeira schools. There is another network, in a sense, or another set of institutions that is disseminating capoeira in West Africa. And that comes from the NGO world, right? So in Ghana, for example, there's a Spanish NGO that works primarily with children, right, in rural areas. There's also a UNICEF program that was you know, in collaboration with African and Brazilian capoeiristas, I forget who's running it now, in the Congo, right, to sort of re-educate children that were affected by war or that were even child soldiers, and having them sort of have a tool to redirect their trauma and their anger and their relationship to violence. So I intentionally have not studied that sort of NGO world, but even in sort of using capoeira as this operational tool of tackling social issues in that NGO framework, right? But there are ways in which, as I mentioned, that kind of tension between Senegalese being predominantly in the group, but then also other Africans sort of predominating. There was a reactionary group established by a Senegalese capoeirista who was one of the early students, who wanted to bring it back, not only to it being a kind of leisure activity for you know, more middle-class, university-educated young professionals, but wanted to bring it back to how it could support the lives, the creativity, and the livelihoods of working-class West African, working-class Senegalese, right? So he started to target certain areas like, you know, the what they call like popular neighborhoods like Gedjawai, Pikin, on the kind of outskirts of Dakar, and wanted to make sure to center and offer this skill set to working class kids in particular. So there's a lot of ways that and Brazil, there's a whole sort of industry, and it's built even into the education system. So capoeira is often imagined as a tool for young people or like inner city youth, as we would think of it, who are struggling with issues around violence or disenfranchisement, and using capoeira in those ways. Yeah. I think we have a couple of gender questions here as well, which I can try to link. So capoeira served as a tool for demonstrating masculinity. How does it affect feminism in Brazil? So I don't really work on Brazil. Not directly. I haven't done ethnographic work there. I'm Brazilian, and my dad is a capoeira mestre from Brazil. So that's obviously a part of how I became interested in the work, but I haven't, studied it necessarily with that direct ethnographic tool. But I will say that folks like Ashley Humphrey, who's did her dissertation on Black women's participation in the United States, and also kind of linking that to the ways that Brazil's burgeoning Afro-consciousness movement and Black consciousness has really blossomed in the last few years. Capoeira is a key kind of political space for where that is happening, right? And so you see a lot of women-centered groups, Black women-led groups that are bubbling up that didn't really exist before. And they're also re-Africanizing in particular kinds of ways, right? So writing capoeira songs in West or West Central African languages as well. But yeah, this is also part of the movement of what I think a few, like I mentioned with Elena, that West African women are trying to also link to those sort of Black feminist movements through capoeira as well. But it's still unfolding. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question about English-speaking West Africa, partly they're, the Anglophone, Lusophone, and Francophone divide is false in some ways in West Africa, because there are many other languages that are connecting people across these national borders, as we've mentioned. But because the groups are very diverse in and of themselves on a national and ethnic level, French tends to be what links the connection between that network that I mentioned. So mostly we're looking at, I've been studying this connection of the social network within Francophone groups, but I think English-speaking African world, we can see that capoeira has also flourished in a lot of other places in the continent that I haven't been to yet, but South Africa has a huge infrastructure, even a lot of sites in East Africa and Zanzibar, in Tanzania, but a lot of that has to do with having direct links, as I mentioned, to Brazilian teachers, right? And so the West Africans are sort of linked to, but kind of left to their own devices in some ways. Okay, there's another question here. Do the performers localize the objects? Yeah, so This question around the specific objects used in capoeira performance, it has to do with that, partly it has to do with that divide of the genres that I mentioned, capoeira regional and capoeira Angola, that they have different orchestra setups, right? But for the most part, the instruments are the same. But there's other questions around not just the objects that have to do with the instruments, but how do you source, for example, the fabric, right, to make the uniforms? How do you source the belts? So part of it has to do with that kind of more classical way of thinking about uniforms and instruments as sort of canonical to capoeira. But there are interesting things going on there as well, right? So it's normal in the capoeira world that if you train or you visit another group and you make a connection there, or you have like a meaningful experience, you might give your shirt to somebody that has your school's logo on it, right? And that person will keep that shirt as a memory of their kind of connection with you. And so I think about the ways that some folks in Senegal have these collections of shirts. The founder, Mokhtar Ndiaye, has actually shirts dating back to the 90s that were gifted to him, right? So not only the production of these things, but the circulation and the gifting that kind of embodies or instantiates these ties that they make with global capoeira world by holding these objects as, you know, kind of precious memories, right? But at the same time, there's also this kind of the same impulse to commercialism, to having the latest and the hippest stuff, right? And so there are certain kinds of shoes that capoeiristas use. Normally you would play barefoot, but there are times also in which you would play, you know, on the gravel and the concrete in places that are a little rougher for your feet. And there are particular shoes that capoeiristas find better or even like hipper basically to wear, that can, like hyena shoes, for example, that mostly are only coming from Brazil. So you also see a lot of these networks being made in order to be able to kind of import or to make sure that folks are bringing the latest trends of what other capoeiristas are wearing into the space too as well, if that answers your question. Yeah, Felicia, I don't know if you want to say something more about that. I'm less familiar with it. I know that with stick fighting, but I know that TJ Desh Obi, who wrote Fighting for Honor, right, that puts capoeira within a spectrum or a kind of pantheon of different kinds of African martial arts, has written about that and studied about its sort of continuation in the Americas. But yeah, I would love to learn more about that.
I didn't write the comment about Ngolo. I see it came up under my name, but that wasn't that wasn't.
There's a comment here on Kalanga. It says here with your name. I don't know if
No, those aren't my comments. I think
okay.
Those comments are coming under my name. Sorry.
Yeah, it's all good.
That's fine.
Yeah.
They use your link or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can answer. I think you had an earlier question about capoeira Angola and female and male bodies, and I think that's something that is really interesting. I think around the assumptions of what we would think of a kind of diasporic return, or what would be most compelling to African capoeiristas, right? So with capoeira Angola being contextualized as the more sort of re-Africanized form, or something that's less codified as a martial art, as a sport, but that has a more loose sort of creative aesthetic concern, we would think that that would be also more compelling, right? But part of this self-awareness about how West Africa gets marginalized in this global capoeira world has to do with their folks feeling like they've not only been left out, but that they have a lot to catch up on, and that adhering to these highly politicized and highly controversial, regimes of genre, right? Capoeira Angola, Capoeira Regional, Capoeira Contemporânea, all of these different ways that there are political fights in the capoeira world elsewhere. West Africans often feel like engaging in those fights are unproductive for them having access to something they feel that they should have had access to a long time ago, right? So even the group Africa Capoeira, they nicknamed themselves for a period of time Afri Capoeira, with the word free in English placed at the center, right? In order to signal that they are open to any and all genres and styles of capoeira, and that they also want to encourage people's individual expression rather than to limit it, right? And so part of this also comes from the fact that at the root of how that group started, it was actually a white Brazilian capoeirista who visited and taught Mokhtar at the time. And he only came for a couple weeks, and then there was a falling out because the Brazilian capoeirista felt that they had to stick only to Capoeira Angola, that if he was to be his teacher or his mentor, that he had to sort of stick within those guidelines, right? And Mokhtar, having just learned about capoeira and being, feeling so connected to this heritage, felt that that was very limiting, right? So 20 years later, when I attended the 20-year anniversary of Afri Capoeira, they invited this mestre back to Senegal, and he hadn't been, I think, in those 20 years, right? And we saw that same kind of authority sort of wielded when just before the batizado ceremony, he banned any and all belts, right? So this is someone who was at the outset, a part of how capoeira came to be, but in a very limited and, temporary way, and then returned to sort of claim ownership over this school that had developed and burgeoned and, developed into these branches, actually, that we now see that folks who were trained in Afri Capoeira have started teaching back in their home countries, right? So he comes back 20 years later and bans belts, right? And because he is this authority, in a sense, inherently seen, Brazilians are already automatically seen as experts and as authority, right? But he also has that mestre legitimate status. Some of the students who had been working all year to get their belts actually put them aside and were really discouraged by that. That gesture, right? And so that created all kinds of issues, but we see how this legitimacy of those Brazilian standards oftentimes hinder and continue to marginalize African practitioners. But the other interesting thing about Capoeira Angola is that it has a certain kind of aesthetic, right? That is not only a certain kind of, let's say, Black aesthetic that then gets taken up by any and all practitioners, whether or not they're Black, right? So you have, for example, at this same event, we had a lot of French women who had trained for a long time in Capoeira Angola, who are visiting Senegal for this event and wrapping their hair in ways that, are very common amongst Senegalese women, right? But that they're sort of embodying something to do with this Black aesthetic that Capoeira Angola gives them the kind of permission to do, right? So the ways that, Black performance allows for a kind of embodiment of Blackness is a very complicated thing. And I think Capoeira Angola kind of demonstrates the ways in which that can be troubling as well. Yeah. I think those are all our questions.
Let's see.
Am I missing one?
Just one more.
Okay. Yeah, do you know that some schools thought maybe links Capoeira and Candomblé? Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and I think it's also part of those earlier topics that we were talking about with regards to how this new Black consciousness moment in Brazil is trying to reclaim histories of things that are connected, that have been intentionally separated by the way that coloniality tries to erase these links, right? So Capoeira and Candomblé, what their relationship is very complicated, and I think there's a lot of work that still should be done on that. But Candomblé is also an umbrella term for a lot of different traditions that are linked to, reconstructed ethnicities or nations, as they're called in Brazil as well. And so one of the things that's interesting is that you'll see capoeiristas that drum for candomblé ceremonies, but do not claim to be adherents of the religious practice, right? So you have this kind of a social tie, but not necessarily a spiritual or ideological tie. But right now in Brazil, we have a strong evangelicalist moment linked to a lot of other forms of fascism that are taking root in the country. And how that plays out in the capoeira space is that we're now seeing a movement called capoeira gospel, right? Which is the kind of evangelization of capoeira, of inserting more overtly Christian symbolism in capoeira. But it's not only about inserting Christianity, it's also about rooting out or de-Africanizing things that are supposedly associated with candomblé or with any kind of sort of non-monotheistic understandings of African spirituality, right? So depending on when you're talking about historically and currently, we're seeing that kind of backlash again occurring of what is inherently having to do with African spirituality that shows up in capoeira. But you do see the names of orishas sung in capoeira music, right? And there are ways in which some folks see capoeira also as not necessarily a religious space, but having to do with spirits and might even link to trance in some ways as well. But there's still a lot to be explored there. And I think that that moment is happening right now in Brazil and beyond.
Thank you very much. I think we're almost out of time. Again, we appreciate you coming and sharing your research with us. It was very interesting. I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience did too. So thank you for coming. Thank you to the audience also for attending and asking questions. A reminder, if you are in the Lansing area and you're interested in learning capoeira, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies are having a free event on next Thursday, April 20th, from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. in the International Center, room 303. So if you're around, stop by and learn some moves. Thank you, Dr. Sarr, for coming.
Thank you so much. This was my pleasure.
We'll see you next, I'm talking to the audience, next Thursday.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thanks for all your comments and questions. I'll take them forward as well.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.